This just in, America has a polarization problem. A study out of UC Davis in June 2022 found that half the population believes that we will descend into political violence and civil war in the next few years. We've had riots on university campuses, in our streets, and in the halls of the Capitol building itself. We've seen the rise of cancel culture, racial violence, police brutality, and an extremely divisive response to vaccination during the COVID-19 crisis. Not only is the world chock full of misinformation, but studies show that people aren't really voting in favor of their own political parties anymore. Instead, they're voting against the other side. It doesn't matter where you are in the political spectrum. Every person in America feels the pull towards irrational group thinking. Sure, a lot of this has to do with the horrors of social media. But even more importantly, I think it boils down to our collective inability to read text for what it actually says instead of what we think it means. I'm going to show you two symbols, and I want you to think about what they stand for. Broadly speaking, Black Lives Matter and the thin blue line neatly divide the country into two distinct camps, one conservative and the other liberal. The cut appears so clean that if you see someone displaying one or the other, you can make a guess on that person's opinion on a whole number of seemingly unrelated issues, from climate change, public health, and even fiscal policy. That's because we are all amazingly adept at reading into subtext. We feel that we implicitly know a whole universe of information about someone from a single emotionally reactive symbol. But what happens when we actually try to put our preconceived notions aside for a second and try to look at what the symbols actually say? In other words, what happens if we forget the subtext and just try to read the text? Most Americans will agree that Black lives do indeed matter. They will also generally agree that police have a valid role in society. Only a tiny portion of extreme radicals on both sides of the political spectrum actually think that Black people should not have rights, or that we should literally abolish police departments. The reality is that both symbols call for inclusion in different ways. One supports the general idea of law and order, while the other for equality under the law. The text of both symbols is not mutually exclusive at all. Indeed, both symbols are trying to speak to the very best that America has to offer. However, for reasons I'm going to get into, we've all been taught to read these symbols in the least charitable way possible. No matter what side of the political spectrum you stand on, just about all of us are guilty in helping polarize our political dialogue. And since I can't effectively talk about this in a neutral way, since I am also part of the problem, I am going to lay my own cards on the table for a little self-reflection. I am a white, heterosexual 44-year-old man who has had a lot of opportunities in life, including a good education and a stable career in journalism. My politics solidly fall in the center-left, and I'm a passionate advocate of free speech. Most Americans do not believe that me being those things on its own is a problem. We are a diverse nation, and all perspectives should have value. However, if I'm driving down the road and I see a thin blue line sticker on the back of someone's pickup truck, my gut reaction is to assume that the driver is probably a white supremacist. The problem with this sort of thinking is that my initial reaction ignores the text of the symbol and the real intention behind why a person might have put that on the back of their truck in the first place. For instance, while the left loves calling the right wing racists, what percentage of the right do you actually think belongs to the Ku Klux Klan, a militia, participated in the January 6 riots, or follows some sort of neo-Nazi ideology? It's a pretty small number to get that extreme. Sure, those extremes do exist, but they are such a tiny minority. Even though we are careful to cling to our in-group group on social media, most of us are a lot more centrist than the way we portray ourselves on the internet. Was it rational to think that the truck driver is an overt racist? Or is it a lot more likely that they were honestly trying to communicate the point that police lives actually do matter, that police jobs are very hard, and that they require split-second thinking, and they have respect for the sacrifices that police officers make every day in the line of duty? If you are a liberal like me, your natural response to hearing that last sentence is to go down a mental rabbit hole that begins something like, sure, but what about systematic racism or unjust prison sentences and the pervasive feeling of fear that every black person feels when they get pulled over by cops? I get it. I hear you, and you are not wrong. In fact, I think that many people who fly the thin blue line symbol are at least willing to listen to those points when they are offered up in the right context. In fact, there's a conservative political think tank called the Nolan Center for Justice that is already actively engaging in a productive dialogue on those points with the liberal left. The reality is that most Americans have the same desire for equality, justice, and security, but that we have different visions of how to attain those goals. And this is where everyone needs to take a few deep breaths and quit being so reactive. Now, let's imagine how that same pickup driver interprets a Black Lives Matter sign that they come across in a shop window. Most likely, their internal dialogue starts along the lines of something like, "It's not just Black lives, all lives matter." For them, the BLM symbol is all about exclusion. Indeed, when I first saw BLM trending on the internet after the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012, I had the same reaction. I'm pretty sure that I even tweeted about it. It took me several long conversations with people inside the movement to really understand that all lives can't matter if Black lives don't matter. And this is a powerful and important point to make. Certainly, it's critical to start beginning to heal centuries of systematic violence and racism in America. Unfortunately, the way that we've deployed that symbol is not fair to anyone who was initially trying to interpret it. In fact, I would argue that it's something of a purity test. We treat a person's initial reaction to the hashtag as a litmus test for whether or not they are inherently racist or even part of our team. This knee-jerk reaction obliterates any sense of nuance from the discussion and, more importantly, eliminates rational inquiry for racial dialogue. Think of how insane it is when someone says what should be a completely non-controversial statement like, "all lives matter," and then they get told by half the internet that they're racist. BLM starts out with amazing intentions of highlighting racial disparities and police brutality that are real problems, but quickly devolves into a purity test. In other words, the community that enforces the BLM symbol demands that you endorse a complex subtext that honestly can take a while for someone to wrap their heads around. Now imagine how that person in the pickup truck is going to respond when they elicit that reaction from the entire internet. While they might be open to at least listening to the implications of Black Lives Matter, instead, they get told their own perspectives don't matter because they are racists or white supremacists. This is a huge problem because once we Americans start drawing these sorts of exclusionary lines, we stop being able to cooperate on anything at all. Even worse, purity tests make it hard to have nuanced discussions inside our own political sphere, among liberals. In their book, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, the civil rights lawyer and social scientists Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haddett Examine the forces that have made it almost impossible for Americans to voice any sort of nuanced stance on just about anything anymore. The most destructive of these forces are the purity test traps that we set up against the other side. But ultimately, those end up being deployed against ourselves. Once these tendencies become the norm, the herd starts to move together in increasingly erratic, unpredictable, and even violent ways. On the right, we've obviously seen the rise of QAnon making headway, first on the internet, and then terrifyingly in Congress itself. No matter how radical and detached from reality the conspiracy theory gets, the few people who dissent and try to break away from that herd get trampled in the process. They're called out as rhinos. People threaten to kill them. And they don't find any sympathy at all among liberals. Sure, we can easily say that the right wing is far more radical now than it was just 5 years ago. But the left is also part of the problem. We act as if you're not with us, you are against us. And we can't claim the moral high ground. Because the left has absolutely been violent too. Incidents at Berkeley, Evergreen, Minneapolis, and Middlebury all ended up with people in the hospital or even dead. The left cancels books and campus speakers and jumps on people who aren't immediately sure that transgender rights are as important as, say, climate change or economic reform. Purity tests require people on the left and the right to become unthinking automatons or risk being kicked out of their club, and then they get attacked. Even worse, anyone who stands up for one of these herd breakers often becomes a target themselves too. This groupthink is self-reinforcing and self-policing. And here is the crazy thing. During extreme cases of groupthink, neither side ever turns out to be entirely right about anything. Take, for instance, the madness we all got wrapped up in during the COVID-19 pandemic. At the beginning of the spread, there wasn't a lot of information out about what was happening or what the best course of action would be. So the right and left offered up a variety of opinions about what to do. Ever-changing CDC guidelines and a divisive president fueled the flames of controversy over whether or not people should actually wear masks or get the vaccine. On my part, I took a pretty hard line in favor of masks and vaccination. I told people who disagreed with me that they were spreading disease and implied they were at least somewhat responsible for the high mortality rate. But I think it's important to look back in retrospect now at how unfair some of my own positions actually turned out to be. I was right about some things. The vaccine proved to be safe and reasonably effective. But mass vaccination, opinionated social media posts, lockdowns, and mask orders did not actually stop the coronavirus from spreading. Indeed, even 100% compliance would not have been a panacea, as new mutations circumvented vaccines and natural immunity. And don't get me started at how inaccurate rapid antigen tests ended up being. The people against vaccination did so for a variety of reasons. But after literally billions of doses administered around the world, it's clear that the vaccine didn't cause mass death. It certainly wasn't worse than the disease. It's not clear at all how their resistance really changed the overall picture of where we are today. Now that we're several years into the pandemic, I accept that this is just the world that we live in. We found a new normal, and it's clear to me now that all of us were wrong about what the correct course of action should have been. There was no way for us to really know. My animosity towards the anti-vaxxers and their reciprocal animosity towards me ultimately didn't help curb the threat of the disease one single bit. In fact, everyone's emotional reactions only exacerbated the spread, and our collective political rhetoric only made us all more toxic. The tendency towards group thinking is literally pulling America apart at the seams. It's making us all lose sight of what I assume is a shared vision of what it should feel like to live here. Both Black Lives Matter and the thin blue line are supposed to be inclusive symbols that uphold the value of citizens and civic institutions. Most Americans agree that we want to live in a civil society that supports freedom and economic prosperity and equality under the law. Those goals are self-evident, but we are so busy tearing each other down that we aren't operating as a democracy anymore. Democracy doesn't mean everyone gets along or that we will ever share a single point of view. It's based on the revolutionary assumption that people can get together, acknowledge problems as they really exist, and come up with solutions that work reasonably well overall. The only way to get your policies to come together in a democracy is by creating as large a tent as possible. And you cannot make that tent by excluding people. Exclusion only leads to becoming less and less influential overall and makes you a little more fascist, let's be honest. It's perfectly okay to have a rational debate between two opposing viewpoints in a democracy. It's completely okay to disagree. And sometimes those disagreements can turn productively heated. What is not okay is to assume that anyone who disagrees with you is an enemy. Sure, we can all argue about who is at fault for how we got here, but the only thing that really matters is taking responsibility for whether or not we as individuals and as groups are making the situation better or worse. For me, I am trying hard to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. I want to acknowledge people's good intentions rather than assuming the worst of them. I hope other people will do the same for me. If you think that there was something in this that I said that was valuable, please share this video with someone you think needs to hear it. Alternately, if you want to dig a little deeper into this discussion, check out my video, How Putin Brainwashed the World. It turns out that our own polarizing instincts are being constantly manipulated by foreign powers who benefit from our own internal divisiveness. Thank you so much for watching.